They came by the thousands, and the city did not know what to do with them. On a cold July morning in 1968, Harlem stopped breathing. From Lenox Avenue to the narrow side streets that had once taught men how to survive, more than 5,000 people gathered in silence. Old women in church hats, young hustlers in pressed suits, veterans of wars America barely remembered. Even men who had sworn to put him away stood across the street, hats low, eyes watchful. They were all there for one man. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the world as Bumpy Johnson, lay still for the first time in his life. And the truth was impossible to ignore now. No politician in New York could have drawn a crowd like this. No preacher, no police captain, no mayor. The tension wasn't loud. It was heavier than that. Squad cars lined the blocks, engines idling, officers gripping batons they did not intend to use because they knew better. Harlem wasn't angry. Harlem was united, and that frightened the city more than riots ever had. This wasn't a funeral. It was a verdict. For decades, officials had called him a criminal. Newspapers had reduced him to a headline. Judges had spoken his name with irritation. Yet here, in the open daylight, the people delivered their own ruling. Respect. As the casket was carried forward, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Not grief alone, but memory. Every man there knew the stories. Every woman there had lived under the shadow of his decisions. Bumpy Johnson had not ruled Harlem from behind curtains. He walked these streets. He faced down authority where others bowed. He made enemies powerful enough to erase men quietly. And still, Harlem stood with him. Across the street, a police captain watched the procession with clenched jaw. Years earlier, he had called Johnson boy during an interrogation, certain the badge carried weight. He remembered the way Johnson had looked at him, calm, unblinking, like a man already measuring how much respect he was owed. That captain never forgot what followed. Now, watching thousands mourn the man he had once tried to belittle, the truth settled in his chest like a stone. The city had never controlled Bumpy Johnson. It had merely survived him. Because what the world never understood, what history softened and reporters missed, was why Harlem loved him enough to show up like this. Why mothers wept openly for a man the law labeled dangerous. Why hustlers stood shoulder to shoulder with businessmen. Why even his enemies kept their distance. The answer wasn't simple, it was earned. And it began years earlier when Harlem was choking under poverty, disrespect, and outside control, when power wore foreign faces and justice never spoke with a black voice. That was the world Bumpy Johnson stepped into, and the world he refused to kneel before. Long before 5,000 people filled the streets in his name, Bumpy Johnson had already become something Harlem did not have words for yet. He was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, but Harlem forged him. By the time he came north in the 1920s, the neighborhood was a pressure cooker. Black ambition boxed in by white power, opportunity rationed, dignity treated like contraband. Harlem was alive with music and intellect on the surface, but beneath it ran a quieter truth. Control belonged to outsiders, and enforcement came fast and brutal. Johnson learned early that survival required more than muscle. It required memory, discipline, and a reputation that traveled faster than fists. He read constantly, Shakespeare, philosophy, poetry, absorbing ideas that made him dangerous in ways the streets rarely prepared for. Men expected violence from Bumpy Johnson. What unsettled them was his patience, his silence, his ability to let another man speak himself into a mistake. By the 1930s, Harlem knew his name. By the 1940s, the city feared it. He rose under the shadow of Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen who taught him how power really worked, through loyalty, money, and community protection. When white mobs and corrupt police tried to muscle their way into Harlem's economy, Johnson didn't just fight them. He negotiated. He retaliated when necessary. And when retaliation came, it was precise enough to send messages without burning the neighborhood down. That distinction mattered. While other gangsters treated their territory like disposable real estate, Johnson treated Harlem like a living thing. He enforced rules. Children were off limits. Elders were respected. Violence had boundaries. Anyone who broke those rules didn't just answer to him. They answered to the street, and the street answered back with loyalty. Police raids became common. So did prison sentences. Johnson spent years behind bars, yet his influence never faded. Even incarcerated, his word carried weight. Deals were honored. Lines weren't crossed. Harlem remained stable in ways that embarrassed city officials who couldn't achieve the same order with badges and batons. That stability came at a price. Italian mob bosses tolerated him because they had to. Politicians resented him because he exposed their hypocrisy. Law enforcement despised him because he could not be intimidated, and because Harlem listened to him more than it listened to City Hall. Still, they underestimated one thing. Bumpy Johnson did not crave power for spectacle. He demanded respect as a matter of principle. And whenever authority tried to reduce him, to insult him, dismiss him, or remind him who ran things, he responded not with chaos, but with calculated defiance that left institutions scrambling to regain footing. Which is why, when a new generation of officials decided to make an example of him, when they pushed too far, spoke too loosely, and mistook calm for weakness, they triggered a confrontation that would echo all the way to his funeral, because Harlem never forgot who stood up first. By the early 1960s, Harlem was changing, and so were the men who claimed to control it. New police commanders arrived with fresh uniforms and old attitudes. They spoke about cleaning up Harlem as if it were a stain, not a community. Crime statistics became weapons, raids became performances. And Bumpy Johnson, now older, heavier, and more deliberate, was labeled a symbol that needed erasing. To them, he was unfinished business. One captain in particular, young enough to be ambitious, old enough to be arrogant, made Johnson his personal project. He believed in procedure, in force, and in humiliation as a tool. Where others handled Johnson carefully, this captain preferred pressure. The challenge came quietly. Johnson was summoned to the precinct under the pretense of routine questioning. No warrant, no charges, just a chair, a bare room, and the unspoken assumption that age had softened him. The captain entered without ceremony. He didn't sit. "You've been a problem for a long time, boy," he said, letting the word hang in the air. The room changed. Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the captain the way a man looks at a wall he has already measured. Slow, thoughtful, certain. "You can call me Mr. Johnson," he said evenly, "or you can call me nothing at all." The captain smiled. He thought this was theater. He leaned in closer, letting the badge catch the light. "This neighborhood doesn't belong to you anymore," he said, "and when we're done, they won't even remember your name." That was the miscalculation, because the real power of Bumpy Johnson had never been fear. It was memory. Harlem remembered who paid rent when landlords vanished, who made sure kids got coats in winter, who forced outsiders to negotiate instead of conquer. And Harlem was watching now. Within days, word spread that Johnson was being targeted, not for a crime, but for existing too visibly. Businesses were raided. Associates were detained and released without explanation. Old cases were dusted off. Rumors of an indictment circulated, deliberately vague but deliberately loud. The city wanted him isolated. Instead, it activated him. Johnson met with ministers, numbers runners, shop owners, and men who had sworn off the life decades earlier. No speeches, no threats, just quiet conversations that carried weight. "Don't panic," he told them, "and don't disrespect yourselves." The streets responded the way they always had, by holding their ground. Police presence increased, so did community cohesion. Officers found themselves watched from stoops and storefronts, not with hostility, but with unblinking awareness. Every move reported, every insult remembered. The stage was set. The city believed pressure would make Johnson bend. What they didn't understand was this: pressure was the environment he'd been built for. And when the confrontation finally came, when authority tried to assert dominance in public, the response would reshape how Harlem, and the city itself, understood power. The confrontation did not come with sirens or shouting. It came in broad daylight, on a Harlem sidewalk, where power could not hide behind paperwork. Bumpy Johnson was leaving a neighborhood cafe when two unmarked cars slid in too cleanly to be coincidence. Doors opened. Plainclothes officers stepped out with practiced confidence. The captain followed last, adjusting his coat like a man arriving at a ceremony meant for him. Pedestrians slowed. Store owners paused mid-task. Everyone recognized the shape of what was about to happen. The captain didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Johnson," he said loudly, emphasizing the title now. "We need a word." Johnson stopped. He did not turn immediately. When he did, his face was calm, almost bored. He looked past the officers first, to the people watching, the women at the bus stop, the men leaning against brick walls, the kids pretending not to stare. Only then did he face the captain. "You already had your word," Johnson said. "You wasted it." The captain's jaw tightened. He motioned for the officers to move closer, forming a loose semicircle. Not an arrest. Not yet. A display. "You think these people will save you?" the captain said. "You think they'll stand in the way when it's time?" Johnson smiled. Not wide, not mocking. Just enough. "I don't ask people to stand in the way," he said. "I ask them to remember." The captain stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're finished," he said. "And when you fall, nobody's coming to your funeral." That was the moment. Johnson straightened his coat and took a step forward, closing the space between them. His voice stayed even, but it carried, cutting through the street like a blade through cloth. "You keep confusing me with men who needed permission," he said. "I never asked for this neighborhood. I earned it. And you don't get to take what you don't understand." Silence followed. Not fear, recognition. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They could feel it. The crowd pressing closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. Eyes everywhere. Witnesses in every direction. Johnson turned slightly, gesturing with his chin toward the block. "You want to arrest me?" he continued. "Do it. Right here. With reason. With charges. Or you can stop pretending this badge makes you bigger than the street you're standing on." The captain hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything, because authority only works when it's certain. And in that moment, certainty belonged to the man without a uniform. After a long second, the captain nodded sharply. "We're done here," he said. The officers stepped back. Doors closed. The cars pulled away. Johnson didn't watch them leave. He walked forward, straight through the space they'd tried to claim, past the people who now looked at him with something deeper than admiration. Trust. And from that day forward, the city understood something it had avoided admitting for years. Bumpy Johnson could be confronted, but he could not be diminished. The aftermath was immediate and humiliating for the city. Within 48 hours, the captain was reassigned. Quietly. No announcement. No explanation. The kind of administrative reshuffling meant to look routine, but felt like retreat. The raids stopped. The pressure eased. Old cases returned to their files without ceremony. Harlem noticed. So did everyone else. The story of the sidewalk confrontation spread without embellishment, because it didn't need any. The facts were enough. The city had tried to flex its authority in public, and Bumpy Johnson had refused to blink. No violence, no threats, just composure and a refusal to be disrespected. That restraint mattered. Community leaders spoke openly now. Ministers referenced dignity in sermons without naming names. Shop owners stopped closing early when police cruisers slowed nearby. Men who had kept their heads down for years stood straighter, reassured by the reminder that authority was not absolute. Johnson himself did not celebrate. He returned to routine, meetings, meals, conversations on stoops that looked casual but carried weight. When asked about the incident, he dismissed it with a wave. "A man shouldn't have to raise his voice to be heard," he said. That line traveled farther than any threat could have. Law enforcement adapted. Officers were instructed to engage carefully, professionally. The days of casual disrespect were over, not because of policy, but because of consequence. The city had tested a boundary and found it reinforced by thousands of eyes and one man's refusal to fold. Justice in this case did not arrive wearing a robe or carrying a gavel. It arrived in the form of balance. Harlem was not lawless. It was self-aware, and Johnson had reminded everyone, inside and outside the neighborhood, that stability did not come from intimidation, but from mutual understanding of limits. Years later, when Johnson collapsed at Wells Restaurant, it wasn't the end that surprised people. It was the response. The streets filled before the city could prepare, not organized, not announced, just instinct. People came because they knew what he had done, not just once, but repeatedly. They came because he had stood between them and systems that never saw them as equals. And when the day of his funeral arrived, the city realized something it had never planned for. You can police a neighborhood, you can prosecute a man, but you cannot erase respect. That had to be earned, and Bumpy Johnson had earned it in full view of everyone who mattered. In death, Bumpy Johnson became what the city had resisted acknowledging in life: a pillar. Historians would later argue over the contradictions: criminal versus community protector, outlaw versus stabilizer. But Harlem never struggled with that math. They measured men by outcomes, not labels, and the outcome of Bumpy Johnson's reign was order where chaos had been expected, restraint where brutality had been predicted, and dignity where humiliation had been routine. The funeral told the story better than any archive ever could. 5,000 people did not gather out of fear. They gathered out of recognition. Each person carried a private ledger, rent paid quietly, disputes settled without bloodshed, young men redirected instead of buried. Johnson never claimed sainthood. He never asked for forgiveness. He simply insisted on terms. Those terms reshaped how power operated in Harlem. After his death, negotiations between outside interests and local figures changed tone. Respect was no longer optional. Community leaders cited what happened before when drawing lines. Even law enforcement, careful not to admit it publicly, adjusted strategy. They spoke less about domination and more about cooperation because they had seen what unilateral force produced. Johnson's legacy also traveled beyond Harlem. Younger figures in other cities studied his methods: restraint backed by certainty, intelligence paired with presence. He proved that authority did not have to scream to be effective, that patience could outlast pressure, that a man could occupy a space so completely that removing him created a vacuum no institution could easily fill. That vacuum was felt immediately. Without Johnson, disputes took longer to resolve. Conversations became louder. The balance he had maintained between street power and community stability proved difficult to replicate. Others tried. None carried the same gravity. Because gravity comes from consistency. Johnson never betrayed Harlem for convenience. He never humiliated his own people to impress outsiders. And when confronted by authority that mistook disrespect for dominance, he answered in a way that preserved the neighborhood rather than burning it. That is why the crowd at his funeral did not chant. They did not protest. They stood. Standing was enough. It was the same posture he had taken on that sidewalk years earlier, upright, unyielding, calm, a posture that told the world exactly where the line was and who had the right to draw it. Bumpy Johnson did not live long enough to see his name become legend, but Harlem did, and it made sure the city never forgot who taught it, the difference between power and respect. This was never just about a gangster's funeral. It was about a city forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Bumpy Johnson did not command 5,000 mourners because he broke the law. Plenty of men had done that and died alone. He commanded them because in a world designed to strip Harlem of its voice, he insisted on dignity and enforced it with discipline instead of chaos. He stood where authority expected submission. He spoke where silence was safer, and he never confused fear with respect. When the crowd filled those streets in 1968, they weren't honoring violence. They were honoring balance. A man who understood that justice doesn't always arrive from above, and that sometimes it has to be demanded face to face. The city tried to reduce him to a file. History tried to simplify him into a headline. Harlem remembered him as something else entirely, a line that could not be crossed, a presence that could not be ignored, a reminder that respect, once earned, outlives power, and that is why they came.